A lot of language learners want to know, how can I start sounding less like a textbook? One really big thing you can do to impact this is to start paying attention to language variation. When we look at language, there's an incredible amount of variation about how different people speak in different contexts, even among people who all speak the same language and have no trouble understanding each other. So, one example from English is the fizzy drink. Do you call it soda? Do you call it Coke? Do you call it pop? How about the words pin and pen? The sharp pointy thing and the writing implement. Do you say them the same way? Or do you say them differently? I say them differently, but my wife says them the same. That's another thing that varies in English depending on region and depending on where you're from. You might say those two words the same, or you might say them differently. Variation is something that we find pervasively throughout language. So start paying attention to it. Start noticing, hey, what are some areas where everybody who speaks the language seems to be pretty consistent on? There'll probably be a lot of those. What are some areas where people differ from each other? And kind of what's the range of variation? What are the different possibilities? How do people differ from each other? After you've identified some of those, start paying attention to like who and when. Is it particular context that certain varieties show up? Or is it certain people? Or maybe just certain people in certain contexts? Like, what is kind of characterizing that variation? And then start thinking about what identity you want to portray in your own language. A lot of times, language textbooks, they just have to make some choices for you. And there might be some places where there's real variation in the language where a textbook just can't teach all the different possibilities. They just have to pick one reasonable option for you. And then kind of teach you that, which is great and a valuable service. And if you go with the textbook option, it'll be a reasonable choice. But there might be some other reasonable choices that might be better for you depending on who you want to present yourself as, who you want to talk to, and kind of what identity, how you identify, and how you want others to see you. So choose some models of some people that portray the identity that you want to have. So maybe you studied French in school, but then maybe you have a lot of friends from Africa who speak French differently than what you studied in school. Like, start paying attention to, like, what do they speak like? And maybe start, if you want to kind of fit in more with that group, maybe start kind of implementing some of the things that they do in their speech in your own language. Maybe you want to sound more educated, or maybe you don't. Maybe you want to sound more gangster. Whatever identity you want to portray in your second language, start looking for people who have that identity and portray that identity. And then start experimenting in some small ways. And don't be afraid to do some things that might be considered, wrong or incorrect in a textbook. Remember that speakers of a language define that language. So when people are speaking in a particular way, like that's the language. So don't be afraid to kind of imitate some of those models that you see, even if it's not, even if it never shows up in your textbook. Now, one thing to do is you can overdo this. So I also encourage you to have a trusted friend or some people that you can consult with who can kind of tell you if you're like, maybe don't say that, or maybe don't say that in that way. It's good to kind of check with some people, especially as learners of language. We often don't have all the intuitions that native speakers have about how our speech can portray us. So yeah, check with some people, and then just start experimenting. Start kind of implementing maybe some of those variants, those kind of non-standard variants, or just variants that are different from what are taught in your textbook, and you just start seeing how they're kind of try them out with some trusted people, and then kind of see how they're accepted when you practice them with other people too.